One of the lessons I think I really learned is don't treat people any differently, no matter what level you are. Actually be you and be authentic.
Tracy, thank you so much for being in her shoes.
Pleasure. Good to be here.
I'm so grateful that you made the time for us to come and share your story before you head back to the States. I'm excited about this episode for lots of reasons, but particularly because your career journey is one with a winding road and just so many golden nuggets along the way. And I don't think any of that happened by accident. So I'll explain what I mean by that. I think you're a very unique person. When we met for our first time, I'll give you an example. When we met for the first time last week at the cafe in Marlow, I felt that our conversation almost eradicated every other person in that room. I felt completely absorbed by our conversation. I was just enthralled by everything you were saying. And so for me, I couldn't wait to be able to share this with everybody else and get everybody else to hear your story. So honestly, thank you so much.
Well, I have to say, I felt the same.
Oh, thank you. I'm very excited. Okay. All right. We're going to get into this. So let's start at the very beginning. So you grew up in the north of England.
Yes.
Whereabouts in the north of England?
So I was born in Middlesbrough in the northeast of England. Grew up with my mum and dad around, no siblings. I was an only child. So I spent a lot of time in Manchester. My family were actually originally from Manchester. And I think my cousins became my virtual siblings and are still to this day I'm very, very close to my cousins. Yes, yeah.
What's the age gap between you guys?
Between my cousins, I have a cousin who's one day younger than me, who always wanted me to die for a day so that he could become the eldest. And I have a cousin who's a year younger, who are really my very closest, cousins. And then, a few years between some of the others.
And what was school like for you? So did you go to school in Middlesbrough or Manchester?
I went to school in Middlesbrough. I think I might have mentioned this to you in our previous meeting, but I actually left school when I was 16. I didn't go to university. I didn't do A-levels. And I moved to Manchester when I was 16.
That's unbelievable in the sense that obviously we're going to go into your career journey, but you didn't go to university. No. And you didn't go to college.
I didn't do A-levels. And at the time, I left school as soon as I'd done my GCSEs.
Was that intentional? You didn't want to do further education? How did you feel at that time?
No, I did want to do further education, but I wanted to do travel and tourism. So I went to a college in Manchester and I lasted about 3 weeks because I had thought that travel and tourism would be all fun and different from school. And the first class was economics, and I was kind of like,
no, this is not for me.
This is just not for me. So I actually went and worked. I was living with my aunt and uncle, the cousin who's one day younger than me. I was living with his family, and that was a very big part of my life, actually. And I went and worked in one of his shops, and then I actually went and got myself a job at an insurance company as an accounts clerk for an insurance company. But then when I was 18, I actually moved to live in Israel on a kibbutz for 12 months.
So talk to us about this. So how did was this something how did that opportunity even come up?
The Israel piece.
Oh my gosh.
Well, my uncle was Jewish. My aunt was not Jewish, but my uncle was Jewish. And I became very kind of involved in the Jewish community in Manchester. And so I met a guy. I met this guy who played football with my cousin. And he had been to Israel just as a volunteer, just for a holiday. And he wanted to go back. And so he wanted to go back. And we literally did this kind of, what if we went to Israel for a year? And 3 weeks later, we went, and it was incredible. It was incredible. It was really incredible.
What would you say was like the one learning that you took away from that time in Israel?
I think probably the one learning was learning more about the global, the globe and how different cultures behave and act. And the example I would use is on a kibbutz at that time, all the children lived in children's houses. So the babies were in the baby house, the 2-year-olds in the 2-year-old house. And, the first week I got there, I was actually looking after the 6-year-old children. And one of the women was Canadian, and she said to me, I can see that you're horrified by this whole setup, but let me just give you another version of events, So on the kibbutz, everyone has to work. It's a working community, and everybody has to pull their weight. So mum has to work, mum has to sleep, dad has to sleep. So the children are in these houses. And she said, and between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. every single night, mum and dad are together. Someone else has cooked for them, someone else has washed for them, and all they do is spend 4 hours every day with their children, which, is very different to in any other society. So it's kind of like, do you know what? Don't judge kind of everybody else's rules by the way that we would think.
Yes.
Now, since then, I've spent some time in Israel and met some of the kids who lived in those houses, and they didn't love it. Not all of them loved it. It wasn't great for everyone, but it just made me realize you met people from South America, from Australia. It made me realize just kind of how many different parts of the world there are, and actually how much I wanted to explore that.
Wow. So you did a year in Israel, yes. Is that right? So then you come back, and this is Xerox time?
Well, I had a couple of little jobs in between that. I did kind of what I'd call basic selling, like, selling merchandise, and I went back to Israel for a year. And when I was back in Israel, I then went to Italy, actually. I moved from Israel to Italy and worked in an insurance company and was using a Xerox word processor, which if you didn't realize at the time, in the kind of, this was the 80s, yeah. I'd been using a telex machine in Israel, and in Israel you spent a lot of time having to code everything before you sent it. When you could use a word processor and delete things, it was just it was transformational. And so I thought that's what Xerox did. So I applied for this job with Xerox thinking, they're so ahead of everything because they've got these word processors, and then ended up in the UK selling photocopiers in London. I mean, really knocking on doors, a door-to-door salesperson selling photocopiers.
I mean, let's just talk about Xerox for a minute, because that Xerox have a long reputation of being the organization that taught on-the-ground sales, and you really had to hustle in that organization. But it was a pivotal moment for you in your career. You, as you say, joined as a new business salesperson here in London, but you go on to navigate the floor through key account sales, sales management, leasing, financial controller, chief of staff to the UK CEO, general manager, and then UK board member. So you go from biz dev to board member. And just to say, most people don't achieve that in a lifetime. And you achieved that and have gone on to achieve even greater things. Talk to me about life at Xerox in that time, and how did you navigate that organization to get from entry-level biz dev through to a board member of that organization?
I mean, it was an amazing kind of background of training. I mean, it was the hard school of sales training. I mean, it was literally, you wake up on a Monday, you went to a meeting on a Monday morning, and you were asked how many deals you were going to do that week. And even if you had no prospects, you had to call one. You could never call zero. And you had to go out and deliver 60 canvas calls a week, which meant you'd visited 60 companies. And every week they ripped up the evidence of that so that you had to do it again the following week. And in some ways it was horrendous in being humiliating. And, the next week, if you didn't have a deal, they would call you out as a loser, or, you had to wear an L on your head. I mean, there were the sort of things you couldn't do those things now. But at the same time, they trained you on how to sell and really trained you. And because it was kind of, for me, it was one of those things where you're like, I never want to be a loser. Yeah. I never want to have that thing. So I have to go and find another, I have to keep knocking on doors until I find something, and I think it was something that I happened to be good at. I like people and I like building relationships, and I navigated my way through probably mainly because of relationships. And they loved promoting people internally, probably to their detriment, in fairness. They always promoted from within. And so you had this opportunity to do all these different roles and be trained in doing all these different roles, which was just, a fantastic opportunity.
When you're, I guess, in the different levels while you're there, so you start as almost like an individual contributor, and then you navigate through to manager, and then ultimately a leader as a board member. What did you find were the differences in how you had to behave or you had to treat people as you navigated that system?
I think what's interesting is you get a little bit obsessed with, and I mean, in every company they have a different thing. When if I'm an M1, then I get this car, and if I'm an M2, I get this car, or I get this sort of benefit. One of the lessons I think I really learned is don't treat people any differently, no matter what level you are. Actually be you and be authentic and be the same. And I think it's one of my biggest skills. Is I think I've always been nice to people on the way up as well as as well as on the way down, because your success will pass as well as your failures pass as well as your successes. So I think you have to really remember that.
Totally. So you do an incredible 16 years at Xerox, and then you move on to a company called AIT. And they were based in Henley.
Yes.
Yeah, based in Henley. How did that opportunity come up?
So actually, just before I left Xerox, I'd had my third baby. We have 5 children between my husband and I, but my third baby, and I was on maternity leave, and I'd gone and done a little bit of work for a friend when I left Xerox, just kind of, casually helping her. And she had introduced me to this company who were doing a lot of work on internal comms and culture, which I met this company and thought, this is just a phenomenal organization. So I contacted the HR director, and he got me an interview, and I happened to meet the CEO, who was in the same position as me. He had just had a baby. He had 2 kids. His wife had 2 kids, and they just had a baby. And he actually just said to me, we don't really have a role, but I'm going to create one for you, which was just amazing. And he created this alliances director role. My interview was actually on the day of 9/11, which should have been a bit of a warning. But actually, the company had been going from strength to strength. It was doing amazingly well. And then they had a pretty big blip where they made a statement that caused an issue with the financial services organisation, and effectively the company crashed overnight and had to be rescued by VCs. So it was my first ever experience of being in a venture capital environment. The CEO and the CFO actually suffered pretty severe consequences as a result of that. And it was one of the hardest times. There was a day when you didn't know whether salaries were going to be paid, whether you were going to survive. I think the company went from 400 people down to 100 overnight. Wow. And, I somehow survived in that environment. But I think as with all of these things, you learn so much through the hardest times. Yeah. I kept in touch with those people, but I also learned to really appreciate the kind of the venture capitalists who came in and rescued the company and rescued at least some of the value within the company.
In that moment, did your role, and I'm sure it did kind of have to change, coming in as the alliances director, and now the company's in danger, how did you have to play a role to help support the company? How did your role from alliances director shift into probably something quite different?
Yeah, no, and my role shifted to become more of a sales director role. So I ended up running the sales team, and it was much more about how can we generate revenue, including through partners who we'd already built by that time. So, yeah, that was how it shifted. So
you're definitely building your way into sales, which takes me on to Telefonica.
Yes.
So O2 also in the UK. So you joined Telefonica and you took responsibility for the head of corporate sales.
Yes.
So at that level, managing 250 sales teams, what was important to you in terms of managing that level of people? How do you set up your teams for success and ensure that ultimately you then succeed while they're succeeding?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the most important piece for me is always to set your team up so that they play in the best position that they can play in. One of the things when I joined O2, I actually came to join O2 as a result of someone who I used to work with at Xerox. So, I mean, it's really interesting. I don't think I've ever had what I'd call a proper interview in my entire career.
Really?
Which is really bizarre.
That's because of your network?
Because of my network, I think I've always ended up that something has happened which has helped me. Yeah. I mean, I have had interviews, but they've been as a result of an introduction from somebody who I know. And this was somebody who was quite young when I'd worked with her originally at Xerox. And I feel like I helped her, but the tables were really turned in that she then ended up introducing me into O2. And what I realized when I first joined is I knew nothing about telcos. I mean, I knew absolutely nothing. All the language, all of the abbreviations, the four-letter acronyms were all things I hadn't ever heard of before. And so the main thing for me was to know the strengths of all of the people in the team and who you could really rely on. And one of the, my closest friends now actually was the marketing director at the time for the enterprise team. And she was one of the most generous people I've ever known, because she just was there to help me be successful versus thinking of herself. She just was so generous in all the information she gave. And she really helped me, because I actually did struggle a little bit when I first joined. I had a relationship with the guy I worked for that was quite challenging in the beginning. And we actually ended up having a bit of a moment where we came together and sort of said, look, we've got to figure out a way for this to work. And to his credit, he changed completely in the way that he treated me. And I think we probably both kind of learned and grew from that moment. So, would
you say also in that moment, you using your voice to break through was probably, and a lot of people don't, in the working world, whether that's out of fear of being sacked or fear of not knowing kind of what the outcome is going to be if they do use their voice, but the fact that it was a bit of a moment and you kind of vocalized the fact that, perhaps this wasn't okay with you and, this isn't how you would want to operate, that's also why things changed.
I think it definitely was. And I think at that moment that I had that conversation, I absolutely was so adamant that if it didn't change, I wasn't going to stay. So it has to get to a point where you feel really strongly about that. And, and in some ways that's hard. And sometimes it's just hard to, when you kind of meet people who have a very strong voice or a very strong opinion, sometimes that's really hard for women to kind of break through and have that discussion. And, I think there has to be a pivotal moment where you sort of say, enough, that's enough. And I'm actually going to be a bit stronger than my nature would ever make me. It's probably one of the lessons that I would say I've learned. I don't think I'll ever be great at this, but I avoid conflict. I've always avoided conflict, always avoided conflict. And I think if I could teach myself something, I would probably say, be a little stronger at kind of, I don't ever want to be in an argument with someone every day, but sometimes I think I can be too conciliatory. And I think I would say, to everybody, find the right balance between being a pain in the backside and just being like, oh, yes, okay, then if that's what you want me to do, I'll do that.
Where do you think that stems from? Because what you're explaining there, is, I think, inherent in most women, in the sense that I think a lot of us can be, I wouldn't say people pleasers, but we do avoid confrontation, and we want to just, it doesn't stop us being ambitious or wanting to succeed, but we just want an easy life, and take the path of least resistance. But actually, and so I don't know where that stems from, if it's kind of a learning that's baked into us, and, is it nature versus nurture? I'm not quite sure, but interesting that I'm thinking about your time at Xerox. That was 16 years that you grew through that organization. Do you feel that developed confidence in you to the point that you're in that room with this leader at Telefonica, that you're able to use your voice?
I think in some ways it did, but in other ways, I think you also always have a little bit of imposter syndrome. And I think men suffer from this as well, but I do think that women are worse at this. And I think at Xerox and at Telefonica, I think I've always found myself in a room where I go, oh, they're so much better than me. They just know so much more than me. Well, they are this or that. And actually, I think, again, that's one of the things, if there is a lesson to be learned, is kind of how would you be more confident? I think I should be more confident. I had a boss actually at SVB who used to say, what is wrong with you? Why are you not confident? when you've done all of this and all of that, most guys, if they'd done this or they'd done that, they would be like King Kiddy when they walked in the room. And that's just never been my style. And maybe I don't know what's right and wrong, but, you know, that's definitely something that I wish I could learn. You know, I wish I could do a redo on some of that.
It's interesting, though, because we say this and the way that you are is also the reason that you are who you are today.
Yes.
And so if you were to change that makeup and you were to change that dynamic, perhaps that wouldn't exist. And so as much as and I say it because I've had a similar experience where the previous CEO of the company I work for actually said the exact same thing to me. Why don't you believe in yourself? You know, you're an incredibly powerful person. You've done a lot. You've achieved so much. When you speak, why doesn't it come out? And it does sometimes, but it doesn't all the time. Yeah. So I think imposter syndrome can creep in any which way it can. So I think, so to say that you've achieved so much, and despite kind of all of those hurdles along the way, you then spot an opportunity at, is it Jar Jar? Is that right?
It was still through O2. Okay. So as I was running the corporate sales team, the head of strategy at O2 was looking for someone to run a small new business development team. And, you know, at that time, it was kind of thinking about what would the next phase be for O2 or Telefonica. And he asked me to go and do this role. And, you know, at the time, it was kind of moving from a team of 250 to maybe 2 or 3, you know, new hires. And I remember at the time thinking, I've got this team and I'm, you know, like people know who I am. You know, there's a lot of people who know who I am. And then moving into this role and realizing that actually from a much smaller team, I actually ended up having way more kind of influence or engagement with the senior leaders, because we ended up looking at a company and eventually acquired them in the US. And obviously it was a pretty big decision because you needed to meet with, you know, the CFO and the head and the CEO of Telefonica. So it was very pivotal in changing my career.
When you identification of Jar Jar and bringing that to leadership, what did that kind of acquisition process look like, and how did you play the role in it?
There was a member of the team, so I hired a couple of people into the team, and there was one of the members of the team who I have to credit with kind of bringing it to the table. The biggest thing is, how do you sell internally, and how do you do the right level of due diligence around the organization and think about how you're going to use that company, how you bring it on board, and how you're going to integrate. And so we set up it was an amazing time. It was an amazing time because we had this kind of like SWAT team who were engaged in, what is this going to look like? You know, what do we need to do on a legal work stream, on a people work stream, you know, through all the different levels of what we needed to do. And once we'd got the approval to do it, it was much more about that than the selling internally. It
sounds very interesting because I did, looking into Jar Jar, this was obviously social media. This was as in the rise and the boom of social media. Jar Jar as a business was essentially, you could enter any number across the world, and you would be able to connect with that person. And this was online. It was
basically allowing you to create local numbers to call someone. So it was the pre-WhatsApp days. It was, and it probably didn't reach its full potential ever, but it was really thinking about, you know, as the bigger telcos were starting to lose their edge, you know, where could you look at making different inroads? And they were a very well backed organization. They had Sequoia as one of their main investors, which is, you know, pretty special in Silicon Valley. They had Intel as one of the investors, Menlo Ventures as one of their investors. So it was it was an amazing experience to go through. It was an amazing learning journey. And again, you know, if you were doing something again, you would probably do some things differently. But they had all of their research and development and their tech teams in Israel. So again, there was another Israel connection back there. And then they had all of their sales and marketing team in the US. So it created this opportunity for Telefonica to explore Silicon Valley more seriously than they ever had before. And, as I left Telefonica, I think we made another acquisition and a number of investments, but Telefonica had about 100 people in Silicon Valley. I think that's, they've largely left that now. But I mean, it was a really big change for the company.
So, because it's at that moment that you take the life-changing move to the US.
Yes.
So you move to the States with Telefonica, and then you go ahead and lead the integration for Jar Jar into Telefonica. So for anybody that doesn't know, what does integration mean?
So, I mean, it's how do you put those two companies together, and how do you make sure the big company just doesn't swallow up the small company and take away all the goodness, which is, basically what you've bought. So a lot of it was about keeping the relationships with the team, thinking about who should be the input person in each area. So someone went to Israel, someone stayed in the UK, and I was in the US doing that. And it was, making sure we had a regular kind of meeting with the senior leaders and, sharing kind of the updates of what was happening, thinking about how to develop products that could be useful to Telefonica. So it was amazing.
Was it because of this that you were then able to set up almost like a venture partners opportunity in the US where you're sourcing the most innovative startups for Telefonica? Was it, in terms of importance, was profitability the most important thing, or were there other things that Telefonica were looking at that stage to want to identify in startups?
I think on the venture side, so as we set up, kind of more of the office and developed the venture capital team, there was much more focus. And it's interesting with corporate venture teams because it's a real dilemma for them, because the profitability is really important and you need to make sure you're looking to make money. And actually some of the best venture capital firms that are aligned to corporates are the ones who have created the financial element as the main aspect. So Sapphire Ventures, which is SAP's, Intel Capital was always very sort of, financially focused. Those have been the ones that have been very sustainable and have done a really good job. Telefonica wanted the strategic element as well as the profitability, and a lot of the corporate venture firms do. And in fairness, they probably should, unless they want to just invest, money into venture. So they were always looking for, how does this strategically fit with Telefonica? And sometimes there's a very fine line between what you could do just with a partnership versus what can you do if you make an investment.
What do you think the difference is?
I used to use, and it's a very bad analogy, but I used to always use the analogy of, why'd you get engaged versus just going out with someone?
Oh, tell me.
Well, it's kind of, you're making a deeper commitment than you do in a partnership. And so it was almost something like that. And, it is a terrible analogy to use, but it is that kind of, we're just investing something together that we may not have done if it was just a partnership. It might have been easier to give up on. And, if you can align your goals to say that you're really both trying to kind of achieve something together because of that investment, I think that's helpful. Again, lessons learned. There were some companies where I would say it's not always helpful to have someone who's got that mindset investing in them. And some of the traditional venture capitalists really dislike some of the corporates for the behavior they might exhibit in those situations. So, but over the last few years, the corporate venture teams have really grown and, have become much more professional in Silicon Valley.
Post Telefonica, the next nearly 10 years of your life is Silicon Valley Bank.
Yes.
How did that opportunity come up to move to Silicon Valley Bank?
Same again. It's kind of like history repeating itself. Yeah. So someone who I knew, Silicon Valley Bank was such a part of the ecosystem in Silicon Valley that I'd already attended many of their events and things like that. And so I was introduced, more formally around a job opportunity. And it was almost a flip. It was kind of, you are doing this role for Telefonica, but we want to engage more with the corporates who are trying to engage with startups in Silicon Valley. So it would be really helpful to have someone who was running that. There'd been someone there who moved to the UK, and then we kind of professionalized it and built that team and grew a bit of a team around that, which was, it was amazing. It was fantastic. And I mean, Silicon Valley Bank, I will never say a bad word about Silicon Valley Bank, because I think as a part of the whole, what grew in Silicon Valley, if you hadn't had Silicon Valley Bank, a lot of the VCs wouldn't have done what they did and achieved what they did. And it was really thinking about a different way to be as a bank. And obviously what happened in the last, kind of few months was just, so sad and really, really hard to watch, be part of, kind of go through.
So on that, SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, prior to this year wasn't, as well known, obviously, as it is now. How was it to be essentially, front and center of the headlines?
It was pretty horrible. I mean, it was really pretty horrible. It was, I think, to watch something that fundamentally was good, fundamentally was good. There was a whole series of sort of unprecedented events that happened, and if one hadn't happened, it wouldn't have triggered the next one to happen. And, I'm sure there's some mistakes on different parts, but actually it was just so fast and so, crazy to watch something collapse that underneath and fundamentally, I think, was so important to the ecosystem. I think it's a very sad loss for Silicon Valley and for the venture ecosystem generally. I think other companies will replicate to a certain extent, but no one will have that as their core. Everyone else will recreate. And, the UK company has been taken over by HSBC. I'm very impressed with what I see that they're doing. I think they'll do a really great job. I think JP Morgan will take and do a really great job. Some of the other banks have taken people. And obviously First Citizens have now come in and kind of taken over the Silicon Valley Bank heart. And I think and I hope that they will maintain the core of the organisation. I just think it's much harder when you have it run with a different style.
What would you say, with your time at Silicon Valley Bank, was probably the thing that you were the most proud of while you were there? It's
kind of a double-edged sword, because we created something that I was really proud of. Unfortunately, it didn't quite end up where I wanted it to be, but we created this kind of working space for corporates in Silicon Valley. So this opportunity really to say there's lots of corporates who are all trying to come to Silicon Valley. They don't know where to sit, and they end up with one or two people who are a bit sort of lost in Silicon Valley. So we created this environment as it was kind of a sublease of part of our offices. And it was genuinely kind of one of those where, I went out and chose the cushions and the furnishings and there was some amazing artwork in there.
It was very Tracy-esque.
It was very Tracy-esque. We were doing it with a partner, and the partner was also very involved, so I wouldn't want to take all of the credit from them, but did less about the cushions and didn't always love the cushions. But creating something where you're really trying to build something that could be a little bit different. That was probably one of the proudest moments. The day we opened that, we then had some kind of issues with it, which I'm less proud of. But the actual moment that we opened it was amazing.
And I guess to that point, I heard this from, you're probably familiar with him, an author based out near Silicon Valley, Eric Ries, who wrote a book, and his notion was to fail fast. Yes. So whatever you're doing, you're gonna, you're human, we're gonna fail at things, but the most important thing is to fail fast. Would you say that that's something that you're, I guess, living and breathing in your career? When you make moves, how do you know when it's a moment to pivot, when it's a moment to walk away from a sinking ship? Is it intuition? What happens?
I think that fail fast piece is very much embedded in Silicon Valley as well. Yeah. And I think, having spent sort of, 8 years in Silicon Valley, I think it's a really, really very differentiated piece of what happens in Silicon Valley. And, when you meet with VCs, one of the interesting things is they'll always say, we prefer an entrepreneur who's already failed, because we know then that they've learned some lessons. The ones who are new and fresh have still got to go through all of that, and they're going to go through it with our money. So we'd rather have someone who's already failed. And I love that. I absolutely love that, because I think if you think about in the UK, I think we're a little bit like, he went bankrupt or she went bankrupt. They failed. Yeah. And almost like there's this black mark against them, which I think is just very different. I think as it relates to career, I always have this feeling, and I think it's probably grown with maturity. I wouldn't have said I did this in my 20s. But I did just think I always felt like I knew when it was time to move on. I don't ever feel like I had huge failures. But there were a couple where I did a few things sort of on this, kind of in the in-between periods between jobs. And as soon as I knew that it was wrong, I moved. Yeah.
You've obviously experienced lots of humans in the workplace. You've hired, I'm sure you've fired. When you think about people that you want to hire for a position, and I like to ask this question because it's always interesting for people to know, what is it that triggers somebody like you to say, oh, that's interesting, I definitely want to speak to that person. What is it about an individual that makes you think, yeah, I need to speak to them?
For me, it's always personality. It's very rarely, sometimes you look at a resume and you say, that's a very impressive resume. And then you meet the person and you go, I don't connect with them, or they wouldn't fit with this culture, or it's not going to be right for us. So, there's almost a few things in a resume that you'd want to make sure someone has the right experience. But for me, it's always personality.
Which is a good thing, because I think you've got to be able to get on with somebody. There's got to be chemistry.
Yeah, there's always got to be chemistry. And I think attitude, I think it's that attitude and authenticity, I think, for me. One of the questions I always tend to ask in an interview is, and I try and find someone we know in common. So if it was you that I was talking to, and I might say to you, I know, Andrew, what would Andrew say about you? Knowing that that I could go and ask him. So I love to kind of get that kind of an answer and see how someone responds, because I think that's when you get the truest.
He would sound a good basketball player.
He did say that.
Andrew is Tracy's son. If anyone's okay. So when you are in your most confident moment, Tracy, before you're about to go on a panel discussion, whether you're about to go on stage or you're about to walk into a boardroom with VCs, what is the power shoe that you're wearing in that moment?
So I love that question. And the power shoe, it always has to be a high heel. And it's interesting because they're so uncomfortable. And I also just saw the Barbie movie. And, when you realise kind of how difficult it is, it's quite funny. My dream shoe would always be a red one, but I actually wouldn't really wear red shoes. So it would be really, really lovely kind of Jimmy Choo, black, very, very nice high heel shoes. That's what I would do.
Great choice. Yeah. Great choice. So you mentioned this a little bit before, but I want to kind of ask the question directly around, you've achieved so much in your career, like incredible amounts. And honestly, I know there's going to be so many people listening to this thinking, my God, I want to do what Tracy's done. And I really hope that they're able to pull out the repeatable themes that, quite frankly, are, problem solving, proactivity, networking, likability, your personality. All of those things have attributed to the person that you are today. But knowing all of that and knowing all of the highs and the lows, what would be the advice if you could look back to Tracy in Middlesbrough? What would be the advice that you would give her if she was to start this journey again?
I think it probably goes back to a couple of things that I've already said. I think it would be to be, a little bit more confident about your own ability. I remember having a maths teacher who told me I would never achieve anything in maths because I was useless. And when I became a financial controller, I remember thinking, I wish I could go find that maths teacher. But in some ways, the difficulty is when someone tells you you're not good at something, it would be really easy to just take that. I think, I probably have some kind of weird inner thing that if someone tells me I can't do something, I want to do it. But I never quite believe I'm good enough at it. And I think that piece of knowing you're good enough, like knowing that every step you take, you're doing the best you can at every moment that you can. One of the hardest bits is, when you go through having children and working and pressure you put on yourself about, am I doing a good enough job at either of these things? I think I would try to say to myself, please just remember, you're human, and just always do the best you think you can do at any moment in time. And at some moments it won't be a lot because, you are in the throes of having a young child as well as working. But I think that would be my main lesson to myself.
Well, I think you're remarkable and you're definitely an inspiration to me. So thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your story and letting us walk in your shoes.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.